Hello again. Sorry for being 3 minutes late. There's some strikes. Okay, yeah. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce you Pietro. Michelucci. We talk about a very, very challenging subject, the role of gamification in the emerging thinking economy, which is clearly a nowadays subject. Please welcome Pietro.
I love that in Switzerland you apologize for being 3 minutes late. In the US you apologize for being on time. So I'm visiting here from the United States with 4 of my colleagues who live on different continents around the world, and they're sitting over here. And one of them is here. This is Greta, Maggie, Lisa, and Ravish, and they're all part of the Human Computation Institute, where we spend our time studying systems that combine humans and machines in different ways to solve problems that can't be solved by humans or machines alone. And they all contributed to this talk. So I wanted to introduce and acknowledge them. This is a challenging topic, of course, and quite a speculative one. But it seems like something fun to talk about and think about and maybe discuss if we have a little time. So I hope we do. So I'll begin by asking you this question. What's the first thing you do in the morning? Does it look more like this? Or like this? Does it look more like this for anyone here? Yeah? Okay. Cool. So hanging on to the 1950s. And then, for whom does it look like the one on the right? A little more. Okay. Yeah. So it's nice to see that some of us are still, grounded in physical reality, but most of us, I think, do feel this magnetic draw to our phones right away. The first thing that crosses our mind when we wake up in the morning, where's my phone? Right? Why? So one answer to this question is we live in a gamified world. So why are we drawn to games? Everything is quantified online, right? We can track our progress in the game of life. So we can track our social metrics. Do people like what we're saying? Are they following us? Is the algorithm in favor of what I'm saying? Is it showing it to lots of people? How are we doing financially? Are the markets responding in our favor? What about steps? How many steps did I put in yesterday? What has my trend been for the last week of steps? Am I getting more fit? And how's my career going? Maybe my impact factor should be a little higher, I don't know. So why does this matter? Why do we like to quantify our progress in life? So one reason why we like to play games is because it gives us attainable success opportunities, right? So let's compare what it's like to live in the world versus playing a game. So living in the world today is obviously very complex, increasingly complex. There are lots of confusing rules, especially when you go from one country to another, which we've been experiencing recently. I'm not even going to tell you some of the horrific things that happened on the road on the way over here. I did not kill any pedestrians, I promise. We feel a very limited scope of control over our daily lives. And I think people, because of the chaos in the world, we have this need to have control over something. And I think we don't get that always in life because of some of these other things, the confusing rules. We don't even know whether we're being successful or not sometimes. we take actions and we think, well, maybe this will help me, maybe it won't. And many of our goals may be unachievable, but we don't have enough information really to make that determination. And finally, it's very hard sometimes to know if we're making a difference in our personal lives, in the lives of other people, or in the grand scheme of things. This combination of factors breeds discontentment. And so we need an escape. We need somewhere we can go where life feels tractable. So we play a game. There's limited complexity. There's scaffolding to help us so that when something feels a little too challenging, we start to feel frustrated. There's a little helper there to make sure we can do the next thing. Often there are clear rules and expectations. I mean, obviously there are some games where part of the game is to figure out what the rules are, but it's still in this realm of tractability. And we feel a sense of control over our success factors. We know what the success factors are, and we know what we need to do to make progress against success. We have well-defined goals in the game, and so the games are calibrated so that the difficulty level is adaptive to our abilities, and then it's just enough to be challenging, but not so much that it's frustrating. It's kind of in that sweet spot. And we have direct evidence of impact. We have metrics, quantifiable metrics. We are progressing. This builds contentment. This is why we like to play games. And this is why the first thing many of us do in the morning, not all of us, but many of us, is we go right to our phones so we can see how we're progressing in a game of life. So what have we done with gamification? What have we done with the mechanics of games in terms of building them into win-win opportunities in the real world? So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Duolingo, created by Luis von Ahn, who also, of course, invented reCAPTCHA. And he's a master of the win-win. reCAPTCHA was the win-win because, there was this barrier to entry to get into a website. And of course, all of us have experienced and know this story probably by now. But every time we translated this fuzzy text, or transcribed this fuzzy text into digital text, we were helping to transcribe very old issues of the New York Times. So it was a win-win. Some people would argue that it's not so much a win-win because it used to be you didn't have to enter a reCAPTCHA to get into a website. So Duolingo is another kind of win-win, where the idea is, as you're learning languages, that when you achieve a certain skill level, and the system, of course, is monitoring closely what your skill level is, it knows what you're capable of doing. And then it sends you text so that you can translate that text. So you were providing a language translation service while you were learning a language. So that was a beautiful win-win. And of course, at a certain point, AI got good enough that we didn't need to have the humans doing that translation anymore. And I believe Duolingo today, Lisa can correct me if I'm wrong, her sister works with Louis von Ahn on this. But I think now it's an AI-driven mechanism, but it's still used to learn language. So another application of gamification originated at the Human Computation Roadmap Summit, which I ran at the Wilson Center about almost 10 years ago, hard to believe. And we had folks from around the US and around the world. It was run in DC. We had representation from the White House, the person responsible for AI reporting to the president's technical advisor was there. And the point of this conference, it was a 3-day workshop, was to explore opportunities for using the methods of human-in-the-loop computing and of course, considering the opportunities afforded by gamification in order to motivate people to participate in these systems. And so we had a breakout session where people would self-organize into groups to explore some very specific applications. And one of these people, Marcus Krauss on the right, had this idea of gamifying career development, career advancement. So they came up with, he and his group came up with this idea called Pathways to Radiology. So the idea was pretty simple, that it's kind of like a citizen science project. You're shown a radiograph, an X-ray, and you're asked to find the tumor. Is there a tumor? And if there's a tumor there, where is it? And at first, because you're not very skilled, your answers combined with other answers to try to use these so-called wisdom of crowd methods to come up with an expert-like answer. But over time, your measured skill level gradually increases and you level up in the game of becoming a radiologist, and you get credentialed. And at a certain point, your skill level is so high that it's actually worthwhile to pay you to do this job. So Marcus, a couple years later, sent me a link to this. And he said, hey, remember that Pathways to Radiology idea? Well, I kind of did a new spin on that, and it's actually a platform now. So he came up with a win-win-win. And the idea was that you have educators, students who want to learn online, and organizations who have some kind of cognitive task that doesn't lend itself to machines, but can be done very well by humans. And the idea is that as students were studying in these online classrooms, that part of the curriculum was to do these tasks, that it was integrally related to the subject matter they were learning. So it was sort of tricky. You had to find the right combination of these things. And then they would demonstrate their competency over time. And for the students who did very well, at the end of the course, the company would offer them a job and pay them to continue doing that same online task. Pretty cool idea, and this has actually worked. There are people who are doing jobs because of this. They're continuing to do this online labor, and that's paying their bills. After the workshop in DC, we had brought together lots of the interdisciplinary scientists, because of course when you're talking about human-in-the-loop computing systems, it's not enough to have computer scientists in the room. You need behavioral scientists in the room, because you have to convince a human to do something or give them a really good reason. Otherwise, they don't want to spend their time on it. We also had anthropologists in the room, entomologists, you can imagine swarm behavior, so that it was really the gamut of things like collective intelligence and just how do we build these really kind of complex but powerful information processing systems. And so we decided to form the Human Computation Institute as a way to pull together these competencies and start to tackle real-world problems using these methods. And around that time, I had a colleague at Cornell University who knew someone in the biomedical engineering department, Chris Schaefer, and she actually just met him at a faculty dinner and learned about his work. And she said, you should probably talk to Chris because I think he's got a problem that your new methods might be able to solve. And the problem he was working on was Alzheimer's disease research. And it's interesting to look at this picture, which I've been using on slides for a long time, but only 2 days ago, I got to see this photograph in person. We had the privilege of visiting Alzheimer's laboratory in Munich, because we just came from another conference. This is now a much more meaningful kind of visual experience for me. So as we know, Alzheimer's is a neurodegenerative disease that has, that brings with it cognitive impairments related to memory loss, emotional dysfunction, and other cognitive impairments. So what Chris Schaefer told me is that they were interested in a specific aspect of Alzheimer's disease that has long been known about but never understood. And that aspect is related to brain blood flow. So if you look at the brain of an Alzheimer's patient and you measure the blood flow in their brain, it's about 30% less than in a healthy human. And they were very curious about why that might be. And in particular, they wanted to look at the tiniest blood vessels in the brain, the capillaries. And so when they looked at these capillaries, they saw, this is using mouse models of Alzheimer's disease, they saw in vivo measurements that the capillary stalling rate, in other words, the percentage of capillaries that were stalled in the Alzheimer's mice was about 4 times higher than in the healthy mice. And then when they looked at the downstream effects of those stalls, they saw that indeed in the Alzheimer's mice, as a result of those capillary stalls, it appeared there was a 30% reduction in overall brain blood flow, which is consistent with the human data. So this looked very promising. So the next thing that happened was actually an accident. It was a serendipitous discovery. They had a new undergraduate in their laboratory, Tori Muse, who was supposed to run another mouse experiment with the Alzheimer's mice. And they said, yeah, inject this into the mice, it's going to light things up so we can see everything better. So she did that, and they said, yeah, and just count. We want to replicate this finding and show that the Alzheimer's mice have more stalls than the healthy mice. So she did everything exactly the way they said, or at least she thought she did. But there was no result. The Alzheimer's mice and the healthy mice both had very low capillary stalling. So she was, of course, worried that she'd made a mistake. She was a new student. She went and explained what happened. And then they had this kind of aha moment where they realized that the chemical they injected into the mice to light up the brain actually made the stalls go away. So this was very exciting because they saw on top of that when the stalls went away, the mice got their memories back. And some of their other cognitive symptoms abated too. So they both realized there was a mechanism to stop the stalling, and that stopping the stalls improved cognition. So then the goal became, so the problem was the chemical they gave the mice for this wasn't something you could continually give to a mouse or a human because it's an immunosuppressant. They wouldn't be able to fight infection. They would eventually die from the treatment. So the goal was to find a treatment. But how do we do that? Well, you have to run more experiments. You have to try more drugs and see which safe drug will stop these stalls from forming or resolve the stalls once they formed. And the problem with this is that there was this analytic bottleneck where in order to go and count and look at every single capillary and see whether it was flowing or stalled would take 6 months to a year when done by laboratory technicians. So we saw an opportunity, of course, to crowdsource this analysis. And the big question is always, if we have untrained volunteers doing a task like this, how can we extract very high quality data? But the point of showing you this right now is just to say, as you can see, there are some game elements here. So we have, this has I don't know if you can see it, it's a pretty faint pointer. So we have this, you can level up, you have a score, and so the task is basically we have a machine draw an orange outline around a specific capillary, and then you play this video down here, and then you try to assess whether or not blood is flowing through the capillary. And at first, we give a lot of what we call calibration vessels. We already know the answer, we just want to try to help people learn. So people will make their best guess and will say, yeah, you got that right, or no, you got that wrong. And we always start out with easy ones, of course, and we keep track of people's skill level. In fact, we show them their skill level. This is called the sensitivity bar here. So some people are really motivated by trying to make this bar get higher and higher because it's kind of like a measure of their expertise. It's an easy way to see what their competency level is. And you can see, of course, there's a leaderboard, and it's measured in many different ways. If you didn't do a good job today, you can look at the whole week to see if maybe on a week scale you did better, that kind of thing. We have a return mechanic. So sometimes we would show someone a vessel and they would give an answer, but we wouldn't know if the answer was correct or not because we were crowdsourcing that answer. We had to wait until we collected enough answers from other people that we could come up with a good crowd answer, and then compare that individual with the crowd to say whether they're right or wrong and give them points if they deserve them. And so sometimes you would have to wait a while, and we had to sort of calibrate that wait time so that it's not so long that people have to come back a week or a month later, but not so quickly that they'll find out in the next 2 minutes. So we actually, by design, try to find the right sort of sweet spot to incentivize people to play a little longer. And this has been a topic, an ethical topic among our team, and we're transparent about the fact that we do this with our players. We do this because we hope you'll come back to collect your points. And I think we'll talk about ethics a bit in a minute, but that's an important consideration as well. So we were delighted to discover that people actually like to do this task. Not everybody, but a lot of people. In fact, we have over 50,000 people registered for stall catchers today. On any given day, 50 or 100 of those people will be found analyzing blood vessels. And because of this, we're able to accomplish the research about 6 times faster, which means we're answering research questions every 1 to 2 months instead of every 6 to 12 months. And because we're able to extract very high quality data, we ran several validation studies to ensure this. The analysis of the data sets by stall catchers has resulted in several top-tier publications related to this capillary stalling phenomenon in Alzheimer's disease. So a key aspect to making this work is wisdom of crowds. It's the idea that each of us sees the world in a slightly different way. If we all saw the world in exactly the same way, then working together might not be so helpful. But because we each bring a novel perspective, then if we can combine those perspectives effectively, we can come up with a better group answer than an individual answer. And in fact, most stall catchers players operate at about 70% accuracy. So, we ran a study early on just to see whether it was even feasible to combine answers from different people and get a better crowd answer. And fortunately, we discovered that it is, but that it would take about 20 people answering about the same vessel to achieve our data quality targets, 99% sensitivity and 95% specificity. But it worked, and it worked consistently. So obviously we tried different data sets, different crowds, doing this kind of replication and cross-validation. But that didn't seem very efficient. So we tried to make a more, say, exploitative algorithm for combining these answers, where we assign greater weight to people who demonstrated a higher skill level. And we also came up with a way to measure the quality of the evolving crowd answer so that we would know, or we would have a good estimate of how good that answer was and be able to stop asking about that same vessel. So with this new dynamic algorithm, sometimes it might take 3 people, sometimes it might take 7, but on the average it takes about 4.5 people. So once we felt like we'd gotten pretty close to optimizing this wisdom of crowds approach, we decided to explore the possibility that if we had an imperfect machine learning algorithm that was assisting a human, that the human could somehow know when to trust the algorithm and when not to trust the algorithm based on experience. And so the reason, of course, that we took this approach in the first place of crowdsourcing this analysis is because machine learning models can't do this task as well as humans, or as well as crowds of humans, I should say. And what we found is that only in the specific case where the human bias toward answering and the machine bias toward answering were different but complementary did we get the synergistic effect. The human could actually learn when to take advantage of that difference in bias and to know when to trust the machine. So even though the human by itself, by him or herself, would achieve typically, looks like about 68% accuracy, in the machine was designed, it was a simulated machine learning model, would achieve about 72% accuracy, actually about 75% accuracy. In combination, in that case, they could achieve 83% accuracy. So this gave us a basis and confidence for exploring this idea further, because what we wanted to do was to say, okay, if it is possible for humans and machines to work together, maybe we can find better machine learning models that can do the stall catcher's task, and then explore this further. So we ran a machine learning competition. There were about 900 participants on 70 different teams. So we ended up with 70 new machine learning models that were all catching stalls on stall catchers. And some of them were actually very, very good. Not good enough to do the task alone and achieve our data quality thresholds, but still very good, kind of hitting like 92%. So one of the questions that came up is, since we're thinking about wisdom of crowds, is what kind of diversity was exhibited by these machines? So we analyzed that, and we saw that the distribution of bias was actually very similar in the machines as it was to the humans. And, but bias is only a very one-dimensional measurement of diversity. So we looked at the top 3 machines just to see if there was something fundamentally different about the way that they were looking at these blood vessels. And we saw that there were, indeed, fundamentally different aspects of their approach in terms of how they were trained, how they processed the information, and how the responses, and even what representation they used for the data. So this gave us a basis and confidence for exploring a new method. We thought, what if we actually gave these machines agency in stall catchers, allowed them to play stall catchers alongside humans, and used our existing wisdom of crowd methods to combine the answers among the human and the machine agents. And what we found is that in combination, the humans and machines did better than the humans alone and the machines alone. So, why did I tell you all that? What can we learn from citizen science about gamification in the real world? So there are some interesting aspects about making a citizen science project work that are related to engaging people in cognitive tasks toward real-world useful outcomes. And to give you an intuition, when you're creating a game, the goal is to entertain the person, right? And the more entertained they are, the more they'll play the game. In this case, in citizen science, it's not just about entertaining the person. We're seeking to get useful information from the person. So we have to meet many multiple constraints in the designs of these citizen science projects. For example, if a person who's answering about a blood vessel takes 2 minutes to answer about one blood vessel, they might be very accurate, but they just spent 2 minutes. Or someone who only takes 10 seconds to answer might do a sloppy job, have low accuracy, but they're analyzing lots of blood vessels. So you might say, well, if your goal is data quality, you should always go for the person who takes longer. Except that we're combining answers. We're using our wisdom of crowd methods. So what if you have 5 10-second answers that gives you a better result than 1 2-minute answer? So it's kind of, again, it's tricky to sort of identify with all these kinds of levers we can move what the sweet spot is. Also, in addition to making it an engaging task, we want to give something back to people. So we put a lot of effort into educational content. So people are learning about Alzheimer's disease, they're learning about the physiology of the brain, and then they're having this visceral experience of analyzing these vessels that they can connect with what they're learning. And, of course, not only are we trying to do this quickly, but we're trying to hit these very high data quality thresholds. So now we can step back and we can say, okay, so gamification has been useful in real-world impacts. But is there such a thing as too much gamification? Or, put another way, how can gamification go wrong? I'm sure this has been discussed by many people in many ways. But some evidence that there could be too much gamification is the existence of apps that help us distance ourselves from this constant pull to pick up the iPhone in the morning. So there's also, in this vein of crowdsourcing, and online cognitive labor, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is one of now probably about a dozen worldwide platforms, significant worldwide platforms that service a crowdsourcing marketplace. And it's been criticized for undervaluing crowd workers, not paying them enough, asking them to repeatedly do menial tasks for very low wages. It's kind of like factory work, but online. And I'm pleased to see that there are some, and I think in Germany in particular, there's a crowdsourcing marketplace that has actually a set of values toward valuing the worker and giving them better conditions for working, though I can't attest to the extent to which that's adhered to or what their experience is like. Another kind of ethical question that comes up is about how these success metrics control behavior. So there's this, I'm speaking to a room full of gamifiers or gamers, game developers, and possibly scientists. Does anyone here know what mechanism design is, or heard of mechanism design? Yeah? A few people? Yeah. So it's incredibly powerful. It's this idea that if you have players in a game and you want to engineer the behaviors of those players in the game, you just come up with the right set of rules that optimize over a set of player behaviors. And this is exactly what these algorithms are doing. The TikTok algorithm is optimizing for content that will be most popular, because that's the basis of its business model. The problem here is that that doesn't optimize for content that is sensitive to the needs of an individual, that's necessarily healthy for individuals. For example, because there's a large population of teens who have body dysmorphia and buy into these kinds of self-image issues, that's a popular topic on TikTok, and unfortunately, it's perpetuated by TikTok. And even in the real world, we see with the introduction of digital monitoring of behaviors that conditions aren't always ideal. So Aldi's a great store. I shop there frequently. But I started to realize, and I even asked some of the cashiers, like, you're working really fast to get these across the conveyor belt and put them in my bag. Why do you do this? Do you guys have a leaderboard or something? I said, yeah, we actually do have a leaderboard. They measure how fast we scan per minute, how many items per minute. It's one of their PKIs, these metrics, again, quantification of how well they're doing. And so because that's the mechanism in the mechanism design that's designed to support this kind of behavior, it's de-incentivizing engagement with the customer. So the customer has a disengaged experience, and the employee is frantically and stressfully trying to do this as fast as possible so that they don't look like the worst person on the job. Given that ethical issues can arise, is there some way we could potentially gamify the ethical review of gamification? So we explored this in the context of human computation and citizen science. We had a citizen science project we were doing, and we thought, actually we were doing this in partnership with Microsoft Research, and they like to be very careful about everything if you've ever dealt with their legal department. So we said, sure, we'll go through the steps. So, because traditionally, and by traditionally I mean as long as citizen science has been around, which is not very long, it's been kind of a gray area as far as whether it requires human subjects review or ethical review. So we went through the process, we worked with the director of an ethical review board, and we realized very soon that the questions being asked were not related at all. They didn't even make sense. We couldn't answer some of the questions because there wasn't an answer. It was designed for medical research and direct human subjects involvement in medical research. And a lot of the ethics that were being applied didn't make sense in our context. So she agreed to work with us to see if we could reinvent ethical review. And so we embarked on this process, and we're continuing to go down this path. So we wanted to change some very fundamental aspects of ethical review. First, we didn't want it to be an adversarial process. We sought a cooperative process with the ethical reviewers. We wanted full transparency so that it was clear if something's happening, what the issues are, and everyone can see it. We also didn't want the results of the review to go into a file cabinet, never to be seen again. We wanted it to be a precedent for future ethical review. We wanted to improve efficiency, much like they do in the legal system where there are legal precedents. We wanted ethical review precedents, so we didn't have to start from scratch each time. And instead of having a fixed set of people on a review board, we sought to have a community of peers who would take turns serving in this capacity, much like peer review in academia. And finally, we realized that values change with the times and with the technologies. And by the way, this is kind of interesting. This is also known as the Red Flag Act. So in the UK, in 1865, there was this law that if you had a motorized vehicle, you had to have someone running in front of it, 60 feet or more in front of it, waving a red flag to warn all the pedestrians and horse carriages that it was coming. So our idea is to allow for an evolving set of values and ethics that could be applied in response to emerging technologies and shifting societal values. So it looks something like this. You have a stakeholder, and they have some kind of idea for an online project involving some kind of cognitive task, and you're trying to create a win-win environment so people do the task, they get something out of it, they get paid, they get credit assignment, they get personal fulfillment, and they're getting something back. By doing that analysis, they're contributing to society in some way. So, looks good on the surface, but maybe there's some ethical issues that we need to uncover. So then we have an IRB expert, there's a decision tree that's been codified to correspond to the existing set of ethics. So, the project, the stakeholder goes through this decision tree and answers the questions. At the end of that process, of course, this is all getting stored for future precedents. And then the result of that goes to a community of peers. And they look at the analysis, and all along the way, the stakeholder has the opportunity to do what we never had the opportunity to do in our own project, which is to say, this question doesn't make sense for my project. And that's really important, because then there's another mechanism that allows the community to say, oh, does this really not apply here? Let's work this out, and if needed, we create a new ethic that gets built into the decision algorithm. And we've actually already built a system that does kind of the natural language processing that will take a new ethic and look for logical inconsistencies with existing ethics to make sure that you don't end up with a list of ethics that are self-contradictory. That's where we are. The next interesting step is to figure out how to get a community of people to agree on a set of values. Good luck to us. So, where are we today? The integration of the human experience is amping up. It's becoming increasingly immersive. We're seeing more gamification of more facets of our lives, and there are many new opportunities for engineering human behavior. That's an opportunity, but that's an opportunity for better and worse societal outcomes and better or worse individual outcomes. So we obviously need to proceed cautiously. This is insane. If you haven't watched Apple's video that introduces their new Apple Vision Pro, I highly recommend it. What's interesting about it, so this is augmented reality, of course. As a gaming community, I'm sure you're quite familiar with this. But what's interesting to me is that in their video, they highlight entertainment, social engagement, because they're playing to a very broad audience. But this is really going to open up a lot of new possibilities that aren't represented in the video. And again, possibilities for both good and evil, depending on how you define those things. And of course, the AI is getting smarter. It's getting more capable. And what's interesting about the convergence of these things is that with the new interface, instead of having to overtly look at our phones in order to re-engage with our digital existence and to quantify our lives, we're going to be looking through this lens all the time. We're going to be immersed in this, probably many people every waking moment. And people who don't have it will be at a disadvantage, just like people without smartphones are at a disadvantage. Can you imagine what it would be like to not have a smartphone in the world today and hear conversations that people are having? Have no idea what they're talking about. I feel this way with my children already, because their part of the digital world is very distinct from mine, and I feel very disconnected from it. I'm trying to learn about it. So it's going to be an aspect of survival, and people are going to be really drawn to it because it will be gamified. And so instead of having these pockets of our lives that are gamified, our financial lives, our social lives, and so on, there's an opportunity with this kind of an interface and the integration of the virtual experience with the physical world to have all these things in one kind of integrated, gamified environment. And whoever makes the rules for that gamified environment is going to be influencing the behavior of all the people. So that's the brave new world that we're looking at. We have ways to include humans in the loop. We have ways to extract useful information from humans. We have augmented reality that's finally going to have a usable interface that hopefully just works. We're going to have new AI. We have the transformer model, and who knows what's next. So it kind of leads to this question, right? Because already TikTok has an algorithm that's influencing millions, probably hundreds of millions of people. So one answer to the question of, will AI take over the world? People sometimes say, as long as AI isn't connected to the real world, then we don't have to worry about this. Just don't physically connect it to the world. It can't control our systems. It can't control our lives, right? I believe if AI is going to take over the world, it's not going to look like this. It's going to look like this. Humans are the interface by which AI influences the world, right? And I'm not suggesting that AI is nefarious in some kind of like intrinsic way. And right now, all the AI systems are controlled by humans. The ethics built into the AI systems are controlled by humans. But I would argue that AI is already influencing real-world actions through people all the time, and it has been. There are different levels of AI. So the algorithm TikTok uses might be a simpler kind of AI, but it's still an algorithm impacting real-world events. So whether it's going to be the AI who's influencing or the human who controls the AI, somebody is going to be using gamification. Somebody is going to be designing the mechanisms that impact the behaviors of people, because there are many, many stakeholders out there, as we all know, who want to influence human behavior. So I asked ChatGPT about this idea of whether or not it could influence the real world, and this was the answer. I didn't sleep quite as well. That's it. Thank you very much, and I'd love to discuss this more if you have any questions or comments.
Thank you so much for raising up these very interesting and intriguing questions.
so much. It was a pleasure to listen to you. So, are you worried that machine learning will take over human computation, and when do you think this will happen?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. Thank you. I think it's already happening. In fact, we want it to happen. One of our ethics in the citizen science projects we develop, I haven't explicitly heard any other citizen science developer say this yet, but we try to be honest with ourselves and others, is we seek obsolescence, and we have this kind of motto, our own version of the Hippocratic Oath, where we say, first, use no humans. If there's a way to do it using a machine, we don't want to waste a human's time with it. And that translates into, if we can eventually make it work using a machine, then we don't want to ask humans to do it any longer. And so with this machine learning competition, we took 12.4 million annotations created by humans playing stall catchers for over a 4.5-year period of time, used it to train those machine learning models. And now with machines in the loop, we still need the humans to make it work, but we don't need as many humans. And we have many other citizen science projects in the pipeline where we're going to need those humans to participate. So we have a pathway for human input. The humans are now teaching the machines. At some point, the machines are going to be able to learn faster and faster. And so it's interesting to think about, well, what's going to be left for the humans to do at that point? Thanks.
Maybe another question? Well, you are talking about ethics, and this is a subject I like very much. Usually, ethics depends on the culture, and we are living in a world that is globalization. So what do you think about that? Like how to set some major basic rules, or what should we do?
Yeah, so I don't know if you could hear the question was about ethics, and given that the world is shrinking and we're becoming a more and more global community, I think if I understood right, the question is how do we arrive at a set of ethics that everyone agrees upon? Yeah, so I think that's the million-dollar question, and the one that we're tackling right now. Obviously, you can't please all the people all the time, we're trying to explore some version of wisdom of crowd methods for coming up, again, for this gamification kind of ethical review system to say, how much agreement do we need? What happens if the ethics are contradictory or subjugate a particular minority so that this minority doesn't have a voice in the determination of the set of values. So one approach that we're taking is we seek to enlist not just peers in the sense of peers in the gamification community or the AI community, but people who will be directly impacted by the systems that are developed. Help them understand what these systems are, make them part of that community of reviewers so they have a voice. And then the challenge really becomes figuring out when there is a lot of dissent among the community, how do we resolve that? And at the moment, for me, this is an unanswered question, but if you have ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Maybe we can talk about that later. Maybe another question?
Maybe one question. You talk a little bit about a pipeline of next projects. Can you say something about next project?
Next project. I don't know where to begin. I think our appetite exceeds the size of our stomach. I don't know how to say that. We're currently working on a project called Beta Catchers. That's probably one of the most mature projects in our pipeline, which is going to be similar to stall catchers, but it's a different analytic task, looking at whole slide images of brain tissue slices taken from Alzheimer's decedents. So patients who died of Alzheimer's and donated their brains to science, and we're trying to better understand why there are disparities between the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in certain populations compared to other populations, specifically Hispanics versus white non-Hispanics. Why do the Hispanics get Alzheimer's more than white non-Hispanics? So this is just one avenue. There could be social factors as well, but we're supporting the biological, the biomedical research on that. We're also just starting now. We met with folks at a NASA conference, and we got some good buy-in and support for this. But what we want to do is democratize astronomy. We'd like to create an Earth telescope. The idea is that we'll make it cheap and easy for people to buy or build their own small do-it-yourself telescopes that are hooked up to the internet, have them all over the world. So at any given moment, somebody's experiencing nighttime and has a clear sky, and then we combine all these images and kind of like wisdom of crowds, there's this idea of image stacking, where you can take a bunch of core images and combine them into a better image. So whether we'll achieve a Hubble-like image, maybe if we have, 1 million people around the world doing this, perhaps we could. But the idea is really to bring real-time phenomena in the night sky into everyone's home and let people be contributors and see how they're contributing to that collection of imagery. So that's another idea we have in the pipeline. We're still working on the ethical review system, and probably our grand project, which is going to take the longest, but we think is perhaps the most important in a sense, is to create a data science ecosystem that allows machine and human agents and services to all work together in the same environment, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we want to create a platform like this, that people can come into such an environment, into such an ecosystem, and create a whole new cognitive platform just by connecting different pieces together. This community of citizen science volunteers to this algorithm, to this interface, streaming in these data from this Internet of Things sensor, and then it goes through post-processing, and in the end we get a useful outcome. So that's one of the visions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pietro. I think we are running out of time. Thank you so much for your great talk.